I got this set of bedsides for free, made of solid timber, some cute handles, but that really dark orange dated stain, and they were really low to the ground. Follow along if you want to see step by step how I take these and give them a modern twist. I started by removing the drawers and then moved on to the backs. Unfortunately, the MDF backing on the two pieces had been water damaged at some point. MDF is very susceptible to water damage, not surprising being so low on the ground for this set. So I made sure that I removed all of the debris and then went around and removed any staples that was still remaining in the timber. Once all the staples were removed, I took the handles off, placing all of the screws, all of the handles into a bucket for later, just to make sure that I wasn't losing anything. I then gave everything a thorough clean down. I'm using crud cutter here. It's a fantastic degreaser. And then I used my Ryobi drill with this brush attachment, which is fantastic for getting into any little grooves like this or any details. You do want to make sure that when you are using crud cutter that you give the piece a thorough rinse down, because you don't want any residue from the crud cutter sitting on the surface of the timber. Once everything was completely dry, I moved on to sanding. This finish was thin. There wasn't a lot of top coat on it, so I didn't carbide scrape. If you've been following me for a while, you know I pretty much carbide scrape every single piece of furniture that I do because it saves you a lot of time and it saves you on materials. But for this set, because that finish was so thin, using the carbide scraper as opposed to just going straight in and sanding wouldn't really have saved me much time. I went straight in with 120 grit sandpaper on this set, followed by 180, and then I finished with 240 grit sandpaper. While I was sanding all of the drawers, I removed each of the bases for the drawers as well. And this is because they were also made of MDF, similar to the backings on the actual bodies of the piece. And they were a little bit discolored, a little bit water damaged as well. So I thought while I'm replacing the backboards, I may as well do the drawer bottoms as well. I followed the same grits, 120, 180, and then finishing with 240 on the body of the piece as well. And then got to hand sanding. Now you can do this with an old sanding disc. I'm wrapping it around an old paint scraper here and moving it along each groove, but using an old bank card is also a great way of getting into little details like this. Moving on to the drawer bottoms, my dad actually gave me a hand to cut out the ply. We simply used one of the drawer bottoms as a template to mark out the sections, and then he cut them with his battery operated circular saw. Don't worry too much if you don't have a circular saw. You could absolutely do this with the jigsaw, which is what I would have been doing if I wasn't at my dad's house. We then moved on to sanding down each of the edges, making sure there was nothing jaggedy there and making sure that each of the drawers slid back smoothly. I then moved on to doing some minor repairs. This piece of timber at the bottom was loose, so I hammered in some bullet head nails, punched them down, and then put a little bit of glue in there as well, just using gravity to run down into where it was a little bit separated from the body of the piece before clamping it. There were quite a few exposed nail holes and a couple of little separations in the timber that I wanted to fill as well, so I'm just using some Timbermate wood filler in the color pine. I really wanted to add legs to this piece to get them up off the ground, but unfortunately each of the bed sides at the base wasn't very thick. So I had my dad cut some pieces of timber that were the right size, and I popped them into place with some glue and nails, just so that I would have something to adhere the vertical leg plates to. You can see here that each of the plates has 3 holes, and those 3 holes are for the screws, and the screws need to be going into something firm. They need to be going into the body of the piece. So I had 2 of the holes on the very body, on the exterior of the piece, and only 1 of the holes over that new piece of timber that I put on. You can find a detailed video on this process, actually installing these plates and legs, in my beginner's tips playlist, where I go into a little bit more detail. So check that one out if you want to see a little bit more information on this step. Once my plates were in place, it was time to get the legs on to see what they would look like, and unfortunately I didn't like the way that they were sitting. They were sitting far too far away from the body of the piece. There was a huge space in between. They weren't flush, so I knew I would have to change that. The only way that I could think to actually rectify this was to create a recessed plate. So I went around and traced out the plate with a highlighter, and then I removed all of the plates. I then got my Ryobi router out and sat that vertical plate on the top so that I could measure the depth that I would need to creating a hole. So where I'd actually got that highlighted section, I was going to be taking out to this depth. This little dial down the bottom here will move this black part, which is the bit, up and down, and that is what's determining how much timber you are actually taking out when you are passing with the machine on. So what I am doing is I'm actually tracing out that highlighted line and then taking out all of the timber that is in the middle. Once I knew the overall depth that I needed to get to for that vertical plate to sit flush, so it was going to be sitting in this hole that I am creating, I actually dialed the router back and worked up to that depth. It's always easier to route small bits at a time rather than trying to take out too much timber. What you'll find if you try to take out too much timber at a time is it will grab on the timber grain and it can get very ory very quickly. So it's always best to err on the side of caution and go little bit by little bit. Once I'd finished routing, I drilled holes in the center where the actual screw from the leg would be going up and into, just to create a little bit of extra space. Once I'd got the legs under control, it was time to paint wash. Now, paint washing is essentially a technique where you are using a watered down mix of paint on the surface of the timber to change the tone. You can do a lot of amazing things with paint washing, but for this particular piece, I wanted to create a neutral base, but I also needed to do a little bit of color correction on the legs. The legs of this piece were a cleaner pine. They were lighter than the actual body of the piece. So I knew I had to have an element of warmth in my paint wash so that everything would look cohesive in the end. I created a guide through the link in my bio which will teach you everything that you need to know about creating raw timber finishes like this. I go through selecting the right pieces for a raw timber finish, how to mix up all of your paint washes, what colors to put in for different looks, and then how to seal for longevity in the end. By far the most efficient way to apply a paint wash is with a spray gun. You can see here that I'm just applying light coats, working around the piece, and I did a total of 3 coats for this set so that I could really match those legs. You don't necessarily have to have a spray gun to apply a paint wash. You can go in with a microfiber cloth or a brush, but what you will find is that it takes a lot more time. So time is money when you are flipping furniture, so you want to get things done fast and effectively. To speed up my dry time between coats, I used my hairdryer. You could let these dry naturally. That's absolutely an option, but I like to work quickly and this just speeds up the process. You do need to make sure that you come back with some high-grade sandpaper. So you need, say, a 400 or a 600 grit sandpaper between each coat of paint wash as well. And that's because anytime that you put water back onto the surface of the timber, you will swell the grain or pop the grain, which just means that it creates a little bit of texture on the surface. So you can have a beautifully smoothed down finish and then you can apply a paint wash and it feels rough again. So that is raising the grain, but it's easily remedied by giving everything a light sand with a high-grade sandpaper. To seal this set, I wanted to use something that was going to be highly durable, that wouldn't yellow or craze over time, but I really wanted to maintain that dead matte finish. I wanted no sheen. So I chose Fitty's Hard Wax Oil in Ultra Raw. This is a new product that they have just brought out, and let me tell you, when I say it is a matte finish, it is a dead matte finish. It's beautiful and it really works well with a raw timber look like this. Fitty's Hard Wax Oil comes in a range of colors, but it also comes in different sheen levels as well. So you can step up from an ultra raw finish like I'm using now, all the way up to a gloss finish. It's water resistant, stain resistant, it's food safe, but the most important thing for me, having little people around, being a mum, is that it's toy safe as well. So you aren't going to be getting any toxic chemicals leaching out from this finish. For my application, I'm using a 5mm nap roller, and what I like to do is load the roller up, then scrape off any excess on the side of the tray before I actually start rolling onto the piece. Hard wax oil doesn't need to be applied in a really thick coat, but it does need to be worked in. So you can see that I am spreading the product around. I'm going across the grain in a couple of sections there just to make sure that where I did that first pass, I don't have a thick coat. And then when I actually finish, my final pass is with the grain. So I'm going from from the top to the bottom. Once the hard wax oil had completely dried, which is around 4 hours in ideal conditions, I stapled the ply that I had cut for the backs back on, and I also stapled the new drawer ply as well. My final step on this flip was to install some fluted black handles. These ones have a matte finish, and I thought that they looked really cohesive with the paneling on the sides. So guys, this is a reminder of where we were, and this is where we are now. I think they look great. It's modernized them. A simple color change, some new handles, and a fresh set of legs does wonders for furniture. I love that you can still see that beautiful timber grain, and the neutral overall color could go into anyone's aesthetic, but I do think that these would be perfect in a modern coastal home. As always, I would love to know what you guys think though. Is it a nail or is it a fail?